This is most likely the most famous elongated skull on the planet. It's been called a Nephilim, it's been called an alien-human hybrid, it's been called an Anunnaki, but what we know for sure is that it was found in a place called Paracas in Peru, which is 4 hours south of where I am presently in Lima, with all the noise in the background of traffic, etc. And it's very large. It's located in what's called the Inca Museum, and it's this skull and a few others that really caught my interest when I first came to Peru 10 years ago. And there are very few academics that study these skulls. They study the cultures, they study the tapestry, their textile, their gold work, etc. But no serious academic is studying why the Paracas, for example, had elongated skulls like this. In the photograph you're looking at now, the skull in the top left, the top right, the middle left, the lower left, and the lower right are all from one graveyard in Peru, in Paracas, called Chongos. And my wife and I live about 20 minutes from this cemetery, so we're able to go and study these people. They died out mysteriously about 2,000 years ago, and academics do not know where they came from originally. At least they're honest in that way. So we're planning on doing DNA testing as well as carbon-14 testing of some of these Paracas skulls in order to find out if they're 100% Native American or not. Now, there has been a lot of talk that the Egyptians, the ancient Egyptians, had elongated skulls, especially during the time of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. So this was about 1500 BC during what is called the Amarna period. And what you see on the left is that is a representation of the daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti called Meditaten. And on the right, we have the very famous bust in the Berlin Museum of Nefertiti herself. However, the thing is that no elongated skull that we know of has been found in Egypt, ancient Egypt. If they have been found, they're probably hidden away in the warehouses and basement of the Cairo Museum because they don't fit the proper perspective of what most academics believe that ancient Egyptians looked like. But obviously, Akhenaten was allowing his artists to depict himself and his family as having or coming from people or beings who had elongated heads. But you see here, this is a mummified member of the Amarna family on the right. And you see she or he has a slightly distended cerebellum in the back. But it's quite a difference between that and then the actual sculpture that you see on the left. Now, this one we do know. This is what National Geographic did a representation of what Tutankhamun looked like. No one knows if Tutankhamun was actually the son of Akhenaten or not. He may have been a nephew. It's a very complex story that's not been fully solved. But when you look at his profile, again, you can see that his cerebellum in the back is distended, and this was likely a birth trait. You also notice a depression in the top of his head. And then when CAT scans were done, some archaeologists believe that the one on top is Akhenaten himself. Akhenaten has never been found, no matter what the Egyptian government wants to say. But below that is a CAT scan of actually what Tutankhamun looked like when he was alive. And he doesn't exactly look normal. But the question again is, why did Akhenaten allow his artists to represent himself, his wife, and his children in having elongated skulls? And the most likely reasoning behind it is that he descends from people, or possibly beings, that were not Homo sapiens sapiens like us, and that they were a royal bloodline. And so what he's trying to tell the people through the art is that we are descended from people or beings greater than you, and that's why we have the right to rule. In the area of the Congo in Africa, up until the 20th century, there were people called the Mangbetu who had cranial deformation, and they say in their oral traditions that they originally came from the Sudan, which is to the east, and prior to that, they came from Egypt. And so it is possible that the Mangbetu people who had and carried on cranial deformation to make their royal people look superior to the common people, that they may have been descended from this intriguing, ancient, mysterious Egyptian bloodline. Here we see that up until a point in the 20th century, this is a child who's had his or her head cranially deformed quite extensively, again, to look distinct from the common population. And this is a Mangbetu woman of nobility. Again, her head looks similar to what we see in the depictions of the Amarna family of ancient Egypt from about 1500 AD. But the missionaries and the government made this practice of cranial deformation to be forbidden sometime in the mid-20th century. So that's the last group of people on the planet who performed cranial deformation to this extent. And in Melanesia as well, you see this child has had its head bound in order to become extremely distended. And these people as well, in their oral tradition, state that they originally came from Egypt. And again, they may have been part of this ancient noble bloodline of unknown exact origin. And then here we see a child as well from this part of the world that clearly has an elongated head, not naturally born that way, but the result of cranial deformation. You may have heard of skulls that were found on the island of Malta. There are megalithic ruins on Malta, and hundreds, if not thousands, of horizontally elongated, but as soon as the public showed interest in them, then they were quite rapidly removed from display and have literally not been seen since. So we're looking at the possibility of some kind of cover-up, not only on Malta, but we'll see in other parts of the world where strange-looking skulls and possibly skeletons are no longer on display because certain scholars and academics and Darwinian believers, since they don't fit the proper look of our humanity, that they're not allowed to be seen by anyone. The interesting thing about the skull lower down is you'll notice there's only one suture line that goes across the skull. There should be another one that goes from the middle of that suture backwards. That's what each of our skulls look like. You have three major plates that develop when you're a baby, and that's what a normal human should look like. So this lack of a suture, doctors cannot understand or explain. There have also been elongated skulls found in the Omsk area of Siberia, dating from about 1700 years ago. And again, this is a royal bloodline that died out 2,000 years ago, as well as the people known as the Hun. This actually is a profile of Attila the Hun. You can notice that he has cranial deformation, and also his hair has been shaved back in order to make his elongated skull quite obvious. So again, the important point is that this phenomenon has been found on 6 continents, and in every single case, it's only the royalty or the priesthood to which cranial deformation was done. So only the ruling class, making it so that the general population physically identify them as being different than a normal human. And as well in France, we have this woman who lived 4,000 to 5,000 years ago in France, in this case with blondish hair, and she obviously is an example of cranial deformation. Then again in Austria, we have this woman, again from about 1,700 years ago. It's most common that these elongated skulls existed about 2,000 years ago in different places on the planet, and many have been found in Europe, including quite recently at Stonehenge. You may have heard of burial structures called long barrows, and in those long barrows have been found elongated skulls, whereas in the round barrows, normal people were buried. So again, we're looking at an ancient nobility class. And even up until medieval times, women, especially of the aristocracy of Europe, had their heads bound in order to physically look different than the normal population. And that even could be where the conical hats of the nobility of Europe came from. They're subtly trying to tell you that their lineage may be quite different from what yours and mine is. Also in central Mexico, amongst the Maya people, they performed cranial deformation. And as well, the mysterious Olmec people, of which we know almost nothing. I'll be going to Mexico next month, and so I'm going to be able to go into the Olmec territory and see if I can find skulls that are either presently not on display or are in museums, small museums, that are not part of this somewhat international cover-up of trying to suppress our ancient knowledge. And even in Polynesia, this is a very early drawing of a nobility of the Hawaiian people. It may have actually been taken by or drawn by a member of Captain Cook's crew, showing, quite deformed head. And on Easter Island, it's said that prior to the time of the Polynesians on Easter Island, that there was another race of people who possibly were taller, were responsible for constructing megalithic structures on Easter Island, including some of the giant moai figures. And they also, intriguingly, seem to have had dark red hair, not black hair like the Polynesian people. And even in Australia, this is not a great example, but if you look at this one, this is from a place called Cow Swamp in Victoria, which is where Melbourne is. And this skull, as well as others, have been dated at 11,000 years old. And experts who have examined these skulls believe that they are not the Aboriginal people, that this is a different race of people who lived in Australia 11,000 years ago and quite mysteriously disappeared recently after that. So the idea that that a standard population is the only population that's ever been in a place, for example, Australia solely with the Aborigines, seems now not to be the case. There could have been other types of humanity living in a place like Australia, as well as other parts of the world. And Peru. This is a cemetery near an ancient megalithic quarry in Peru, and notice the size of the skull on the right, as well as the one next to it on the left. They're very much larger than the other skulls in this grave, and one of the key things that we're trying to look at are the skulls that seem to be physically larger than examples with cranial deformation. You can change the shape of the skull, but you can't change the actual volume. So what we're looking at is the possibility that these are the remnants of an ancient bloodline of humanity, or possibly something else, that died out in the distant past, probably wiped out by standard humans, but they carry themselves all over the world in different cultures as the nobility of that area. And here we have quite an amazing skull. This is about 3,000 to 4,000 years old. and it's from a culture called the Huancarani who lived south of Lake Titicaca. Lake Titicaca is half in Peru, half in Bolivia, and has very mysterious megalithic sites attached to it. And so the Huancarani people, almost nothing is known of them, but I've seen many of these in person, and they're very large, and no academics are presently studying them. As well as at Tiwanaku and Pumapunku, which some of you may have heard of. Pumapunku is a megalithic site that was not created by the local indigenous people. It's clearly an example of lost ancient high technology because you find stone shaping there, which is at least 21st century in terms of its sophistication. It was not done by primitive people. And so it's interesting that you find numerous elongated skulls there. And in fact, at all of the megalithic sites in Peru and Bolivia, we always find the presence of elongated skulls, which have not been properly identified because there are no carbon-14 or DNA laboratories in either Peru or Bolivia that can analyze these skulls. So they've been likely misidentified as being from more recent cultures, when in fact they could be much, much older, and again, of a very complex composition or ancestry. This amazing skull was discovered about 3 years ago near Pumapunku on private property, close to Lake Titicaca. Actually, next to a restaurant, a man was excavating for a building, and he discovered an ancient cemetery of these elongated skulls. Unfortunately, this one was stolen about 2 years ago, and so all I have are photographs and some video. They've tried to do some facial reconstructions of the ones at Pumapunku and Tiwanaku, and they don't really look like the local indigenous population. But again, what we're planning on doing are DNA and carbon-14 testing, along with the thing that we have to do, though, is we have to work with both the Bolivian and Peruvian governments because these ancient skulls are their property. And so that is becoming quite a tedious process, but we are able to, or slowly are able to get them convinced that it's in their historical interest to allow the analysis of these skulls to be done. Now, we start getting into the really interesting specimens like this one. This was found in Bolivia, likely near Lake Titicaca, and as you can see, its skull is the size of its torso. So this is not an example of cranial deformation. It's likely that this individual was born that way. We've definitely ruled out hydrocephaly or water on the brain because hydrocephaly produces a round shape like a beach ball, not a vertical cone head like this one. And also, if we look at the hair color, we will notice that it's not black, which it should be if this person was Native American, but it's a brownish red. And that's something else that I'm studying at this time. As well, this is another interesting example of a baby or young child that was found in the highlands of Peru, but wasn't necessarily from the highlands. It may have been from the coast. Again, its head is the size of its torso. Notice its gold fingernails. And this one was found by people, actually tomb robbers, and they attempted to export it out of the country because there are several collectors around the world, especially in Europe and maybe the US, who collect strange artifacts like this illegally. The problem with that is A, the cultural heritage of the country disappears, and also it means that they can no longer be analyzed. So this one might be in the storage area of the Central Museum in Lima, in Peru, and I'm trying to track it down. Now, the Inca, we know, in fact, had elongated skulls, as the result of cranial deformation up until the early 1500s. But when the Spanish conquered the Inca and saw that they performed this practice of binding their babies to alter the shape of their heads, they made it illegal. And so the Inca were likely the last people of Peru to perform cranial deformation. However, the examples that you see in this picture have not been carbon-14 tested, so we don't honestly know how old they are, or in fact, what culture they do in fact come from. Now we get into even stranger ones. This one was found at an ancient site called Huaytara, which is in between Cusco to the east and Paracas on the coast of Peru. Now, Cusco and Paracas are connected by an ancient road system, and Huaytara is on that road. This is in a small museum at Huaytara. They don't know what culture it came from. They don't know how old it is because, again, they don't have carbon-14 testing. So it's not really identified. But again, notice that the head is the size of the torso. And when we get a close-up of it, it's unlikely that this is an example of cranial deformation because the shape appears, at least to me, to be quite natural looking. So again, we're looking at a mystery. This example, I would very much like to have carbon-14 testing. And yes, it does have very big eyes, which is regard as being the natural elongated skulls. And so it'll just mean that I'll have to make a petition with the Peruvian government to see if I can have this one analyzed. Now, in terms of cranial deformation or head binding, this is the standard way that it was done. This is literally from a group of Native American people called the Flathead Indians, and this is cradle headboarding. And so you can see the flattening of the adult, and the baby is in the process of having his or her head cranially deformed, which normally would take between 2 and 3 years, starting soon after childbirth. And these are other techniques that were used to perform cranial deformation. Again, the reason why it was done to newborn babies is because the calcium of the bone has not formed, and so a baby's head is quite malleable. But by 3 years, it's fully calcified, and so the person maintains that shape up until they die, basically. And then in Peru, this is more likely the technique that was used, maybe amongst the Inca and other cultures. You see either a piece of wood or stone in the front and back, and you get a gradual flattening of the surfaces. But that's where the ones that are rounded are quite suspicious because they're not flat. And up until the 20th century, east of Cusco, the people of the Ucayali area used to bind their children's heads. Again, only the nobility. But this practice, again, was stopped by the Peruvian government and also missionaries who thought it was quite horrific. But it's in the art again. Why would there be depictions of what appear to be natural elongated skulls if in fact these people didn't look this way originally or at some time in the past? We can't say that the ancient Egyptians didn't look like this, but we haven't been able to find one skull on public view that has this shape, but there's clearly something to it. And compared to the cone head ones that I'll be showing you from Peru, this is the more common depiction amongst the Egyptians, again, during the Amarna period of Akhenaten. You see horizontal elongation and a much larger cerebellum than what normal humans look like. Other artifacts that I've seen include this one from the Lake Titicaca area. And again, we see a lot of depictions in the art. In the middle, you have the creator god called Viracocha, and he is flanked on either side by a woman. and each woman is not only much taller than he is, but seem to have elongated heads. Again, possibly trying to tell us that the so-called gods were in fact people that had elongated heads of some kind. They bred with humanity. Over time, the common genetics of normal humans would start to take over as the bloodline began to dilute. And so that's likely when cranial deformation began, was to bring the look of the elongated skull back to the nobility. But the origins could very well likely be that people were born this way. And here's another little bronze sculpture from Lake Titicaca, again showing an elongated head. And yet another one. There are many of these. So clearly it's intimating that something was going on in the distant past. And this is amongst the Paracas people. This is a pendant from a necklace showing clearly an elongated head. It's either made of bone or stone. And it's actually the Paracas people that I'm going to be focusing on as we go along, because they had the largest elongated skulls in the world. So this is where Paracas is. You can see where it says Lima, and then where the red area is encircled, that's Paracas, 4 hours south of Lima. If you look to the east, you'll see Cusco, and then down to the southwest, that's where we have Lake Titicaca, and we also have the area called Pumapunku and Tiwanaku. And all of these areas were connected by an ancient road system older than the Inca. So this road system could be 2 or more thousand years old, connecting up these sites of places where we find people with elongated heads. Now this is a depiction of a Paracas noble person. This was done by an archaeologist. The Paracas also wore turbans, which is very atypical of this part of the world, hinting maybe that there's some kind of Middle Eastern genetics involved, that the Paracas may originally have come not or did not evolve in Paracas or in Peru at all, but came from another part of the world. And this again is an archaeologist's depiction. Notice the size of the head that they are depicting there. That's clearly larger than a normal skull. So it's not an example of cranial deformation, but it's interesting that archaeologists would at least hint through drawings like this that we're looking at something not normally human. And this video, hopefully it'll work. Oh, okay, the video's not going to work. But this is a depiction by Marcia K. Moore of a 3D representation of one of the Paracas people. Now, the Paracas had the most sophisticated textiles in all of the Americas. They were quite good at metallurgy. They were masters at agriculture, and yet archaeologists can't figure out where they originated from. There doesn't seem to be any evolution of them from a previous culture. They just suddenly appear. And that's why it's my theory that they didn't first evolve in the Paracas area of Peru, but may likely have come from another part of the world. And this is a classic Paracas elongated head. It could very well be the result of cranial deformation, but you notice the shape and the size are quite large. And what's equally as intriguing is the red hair. Now, we believe this is genetically red hair, and so we have samples being sent to the United States for analysis. The initial analysis has said from one of the world experts that this is not typical of Native American hair because it's much finer, it's wavy, and the red color appears to be natural. So if it turns out that this is natural red hair, then clearly the Paracas people were not 100% Native American in origin. And here we have Senor Juan Navarro of the Paracas Museum. and he's holding a 20-month-old baby that died 1900 years ago. And when it was unwrapped, it was wrapped in textiles, and when it was unwrapped, it had strawberry blonde hair. So again, if it's the case that the hair color is natural, then we're looking at something which is not 100% Native American. And unfortunately, we had a mold made of the baby, which is on the right. The one on the left is probably 1 year old. We think the one on the right was 20 months old, but look at the size of the head. And unfortunately, the skull on the right was sprayed with material so that we could make a mold from it. And that instantaneously turned or darkened the hair from its really beautiful blonde color to this kind of dull red color. So this is the area of Paracas, Peru. You see where it says Pisco. Paracas is just below it. It's the largest natural bay on the coast of Peru. And so if you were a seafarer from somewhere to the west, this would be a natural place for you to establish your settlement, because the bay would protect you from the winds. And again, this seems to be the origin point on the coast of Peru of the mysterious elongated Paracas people. And Nazca, which is quite close by, it's about 4 hours drive to the northeast. And what we now know is that many of the Nazca lines and figures were not created by the Nazca people, but were created by the Paracas people before that. And even conventional archaeologists admit that this one, which is the famous astronaut that cannot be seen from the ground, but can only be seen from the air, and appears to be waving, that the astronaut was made by the Paracas people. The question is, who's he waving to? Now, this figure is the spider, and the spider we know was made by the Nazca up until 600 AD, which is when the Nazca people disappeared. But you notice the difference in design. The astronaut is more three-dimensional, whereas the spider, which was done by the Nazca, is simply an outline. So that by itself tells you that it's possible that different people made these different figures. Then we have the candelabro, which many of you may not have heard of, but the candelabro is at Paracas. It's 450 feet tall, can only be seen from the ocean or from the air, and was known to have been made by the Paracas people about 450 years before the existence of the Nazca. The Nazca people actually moved in from the north, exterminated the long-headed Paracas people, and took over the area, because in the archaeological record, the elongated skulls and the red hair disappear once you have the arrival of the Nazca. So don't necessarily call the mysteries of the Nazca geoglyphs and lines the result of the Nazca people, but think more about their predecessors, the Paracas. Now, what we think this thing is a representation of an upside-down Southern Cross. And the Southern Cross was used as a navigational instrument by people throughout the Pacific. So it's quite possible that the Paracas people were deep-sea mariners and used this as their homing beacon. Now back to Easter Island, which is the next point of land, about 2,000 miles southwest of Paracas. You have the giant moai figures, and all of the big heads that you see on Easter Island are not simply heads, they are all full bodies. So when you see the head, imagine that the body is underground, which it is, buried. But the top knots here do not represent hats, it represents an ancient bloodline of red hair. So that's where we have a connection between the red hair of the coast of Peru and Polynesia, and likely farther westward, quite possibly into the Middle East, which is, of course, is where some of the oldest cultures come from, such as the Sumerians. Now, there are many different shapes and sizes of the skulls, elongated skulls in Paracas. Notice the one in the top left corner. Now that's very odd looking and is in the back room of a museum. I more or less illegally took this photograph because they wouldn't let me take pictures, but there are hundreds of elongated skulls in the back of this museum, which are not on public display and are not being studied by any academics as far as I know. Also, the Paracas people were experts at trepanation, which is brain surgery, at least 2,000 years ago. Most commonly, the brain surgery was done either through the front or the back of the head, and it's likely what they were trying to do was to get at the different glands, such as the pineal gland, in order to stimulate brain activity, because if it's true that the original people had elongated and larger skulls and brains than what we have, as they bred in with normal people, the higher faculties that they would have had would slowly start to disappear, such as telepathy and higher levels of consciousness. And so by stimulating these mixed people who were part Paracas and part normal human, by stimulating the glands, it's possible that they were trying to trigger some of the more ancient thought processes. And here's another example of trepanation where the patient completely healed. Studies have shown that up to 50% of the surgeries were successful 2,000 plus years ago. Now, this is what your skull looks like. You have a frontal plate, two parietal plates, and an occipital plate in the back. And when you die, this is what you look like. This is what all humanity is supposed to look like. You have the sagittal suture going down the back, and then you have the frontal suture here going across, creating a T-shape. However, what we find in some of the elongated skulls is a lack of the sagittal suture altogether. There's only one suture line, and no doctor who's studied these with me has been able to explain what this phenomenon is. They don't understand how this person could even be birthed. And as we zoom in, you can see there is no suture line whatsoever. And here is just another example of an elongated skull missing that suture. Now, in the back of a normal skull, you see the suture lines. And what's curious about every single one of the elongated skulls that I've looked at is it has these two holes in the back, which no medical official, and I've shown these skulls in person to at least 20 different doctors, nurses, dentists, etc., and they're all completely perplexed because they didn't understand this stuff in medical school. And this is a close-up of it. So you can question, what do these holes represent? Are they part of the cranial deformation process? No. In fact, if you look at this normal skull from the Inca time period, not an Inca person, but from 500 years ago, and you look at the lower jaw, you'll see there's a hole called a foramen. And that is what we all have. That's where blood and nerve flow comes out of to feed the lower jaw, because it's quite far away from the actual spinal column and major blood flow system in the spine. And this is a comparison between, again, a normal skull here and a classic Paracas skull. So it's quite possible that what these holes are something that evolution has done in order to create a system of blood and nerve flow for a skull that is much, much larger genetically than a normal skull. At least that's the present theory that we're working on. This gives you the profile of that skull, and you see how complex it is, including the back of the head, or the upper back of the head. There is an indentation where you can see distinctly where the two hemispheres of the brain would reside. And so I don't think this is an example of cranial deformation. I think this person may have been born this way. This may be the last, or one of the last of the Paracas that was genetically different from those with cranial deformation. but we have yet to DNA test or carbon-14 test this and others. And what you have to understand is, in terms of studying ancient DNA like this 2,000 plus years ago, there are only 10 laboratories on the planet that can do ancient DNA testing. It's not like you having a blood sample and having it tested. DNA that's 2,000 years old is completely broken down, and only 10 labs in the world can properly study that material. Of course, if there were people with natural elongated skulls, what was their, or were their thought processes? Were the contact between the left and right hemispheres so much different that they thought completely different, or in some ways different than us? And now we have one of my absolute favorite examples. This is called Waikiki, and it's a small skeleton thought to be 1,000 years old, located in a museum 1 hour south of Cusco in Peru. And this is Senior Renato holding Waikiki. Again, you see that Waikiki's head is the size of her torso. We do know that she was a female, but we haven't genetically tested her yet. And she is, so far, one of a kind. Unfortunately, her legs are missing and both of her hands, but no medical professional that's looked at Waikiki has been able to understand what it is that he or she is looking at. One nurse from Australia literally just said, that is not one of us. Waikiki's dentition is different. She has the dentition of a 7-year-old, yet she has the development of a 2-year-old in terms of calcification of her body. So she's quite a mystery. And this is what Marcia K. Moore believes that Waikiki looked like. We've also learned that Waikiki was the result of sacrifice. She was sacrificed and murdered or killed about 1,000 years ago. We don't know why, but in the future, she is a major focus of our scientific investigation. And this is what Marcia believes that Waikiki may have looked like when she was alive. Then we have the famous Star Child skull that you see on the left. Hopefully some of you have heard of the Star Child skull. Star Child, again, is thought to be only one of a kind, was found in Mexico about 800 years ago, has at least 25 to 30 different physical and anatomical properties which make it not human, including the shape and size of the eye sockets, the lack of a proper nasal system. The composition of the skull is not that of bone, as in human bone, but more like dental enamel. But again, academics will not look at this seriously. They simply say it's a freak, it's one of a kind, no other will ever be found. And as is usual, they simply dismiss anything that, that doesn't fit their picture of either evolution or anatomy or history. And that's my job and your job. So here we have Lloyd Pye with what is to believe, thought to be believed as the only Star Child skull. And yet, surprise, here's number 2. This one is located in our Paracas History Museum in Peru. Notice the size of the eye sockets. Notice where the optic nerve goes in. Have a look at the sinus system. It doesn't fit anything in terms of known disease or other abnormality. Also, where is the mouth supposed to be? There's no proper jaw. Again, you can see inside the sinus system. It's completely abnormal. It's not an example of water on the brain or hydrocephaly. And this is what Marcia K. Moore honestly believes that this individual looked like. Marcia is not necessarily a big UFO or aliens buff. She's simply an artist who reproduces what it is based on anatomical research of what she thinks something or someone looks like. So initial DNA testing that was done of Paracas DNA stated, whatever the sample labeled 3A has come from, it had mitochondrial DNA with mutations unknown in any human, primate, or animal known so far. The data are very sketchy though, and a lot of sequencing still needs to be done to recover the complete mitochondrial sequence. But a few fragments I was able to sequence from this sample, 3A, indicates that if these mutations will hold, we're dealing with a new human-like creature, very different from Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, and Denisovans. I'm not sure it will even fit into the known evolutionary tree. And of course, if you're looking at a alien-human hybrid or a lost line of humanity, that's exactly what you're going to find. You'll find similarities and differences, especially with a hybrid. Now, the unfortunate thing about this DNA testing was that when the president of the lab in the US found out that our geneticist was doing this work, he was immediately fired and has not been able to continue his work. So when you say, you know, why isn't this work being done? It's because a lot of people don't want it to happen. So disclosure is the same thing. It has to be done incrementally. You're not going to have the government suddenly surprise you with all this result. You have to find it for yourself or connect with people who are actively doing it and are not influenced by universities, institutions, or governments. So I've had numerous different doctors and nurses and dentists look at the skulls of Paracas, and as soon as they go home, I never hear from them again. So again, you see how difficult this job is. But we persevere, and here's an example again of what Marcia K. Moore believes one of the Paracas looked like when it was alive 2,000 years ago. And then here we have another example. And actually, thanks for Dominique saying about a fundraiser. We don't need that. In fact, we have a treasure chest now of money that has been donated so that we can conduct the DNA testing and the carbon-14 testing. And it's been donated by private individuals, so we don't have to get permission necessarily from any institution to do this. We're doing it. This is the way things are done these days. Grassroots, not the government should do this or the president should do that. It's like you do it or find somebody who can do it. And that's what we're doing. And as soon as we get the results, they will be put on the internet for the global audience. You know, we're not selling tickets. All of this data goes to you automatically because it belongs to you, all 7 billion of you on this planet. So it's thanks to this man in the middle, Ele Marzulli. He was able to get the fundraising through some very wealthy people who simply want the truth of our history to be known. And so kudos to my friend Ele. This is an example of an elongated skull and skeleton I've not been able to find yet. It's in an obscure museum somewhere near Lake Titicaca in Bolivia. But the more that I research, the more I find. And the more I find, the more I present through Facebook and my YouTube channel and other ways of getting the information out to you. This is an example of a baby that's in a museum in Germany. Notice the red hair. And also this is from Peru, and I think it's probably from Paracas. You see the X-ray on the right showing that the size of the skull is much larger, or at least the size of the torso, which is an ongoing theme that we see. And this is one I'm still trying to track down. It is a drawing from the 19th century of an 8-year-old fetus. It is likely that this specimen is in the main museum in Lima, Peru, which I'm about half an hour away from. And I know the director of that museum, and I'm going to try to track it down. If this example actually exists, then we're looking at a very large elongated skull that was formed in a mother's womb, therefore not an example of cranial deformation. And these are drawings by a great American artist. And again, his name is Marc Laplume. He does this for free, and he's done about 3,000 skulls so far. And again, he doesn't try to exaggerate anything. He simply fleshes out a skull and shows us what we're looking at. And in case you're interested, my latest book is available on Amazon in both ebook and paperback, where I track down all the known locations in Peru and Bolivia of elongated skulls. Intriguingly, all of the elongated skulls, except the Paracas ones, as well as all of the megalithic works in Peru and Bolivia, are located on what is called the Path of Viracocha, which is what this drawing shows you. So I'm doing further research into that. Tiwanaku, Machu Picchu, Ollantaytambo, and other ancient sites are all located on this line, which could be an ancient earth grid relating the megalithic sites with ancient energy, the use of ancient energy, etc.